Yay, it's working. So last week, guys, we had a technical difficulties where we had a webinar, we started it, and we said, okay, we're going to hop over to YouTube. No YouTube. We had a few hundred people that were waiting to get to us on YouTube. So we actually are able to get into the webinar now. So 1 second. We started it, and we said, okay, we're going to hop over to YouTube. No YouTube. We had a few hundred people that were waiting to get to us on YouTube. So we actually are able to get into the webinar now. So 1 second. So we actually are able to get into the webinar now. 1 second. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or whenever you're going to watch this replay, because we're here for an exciting program today. Wanted to welcome you guys in and tell you a little bit of the logistics for today. So we're going to be actually taking questions and answers along the way. So there's actually, if you can use the question and answer function on Zoom, you guys can ask your questions and we'll make sure that our speaker gets them answered. And I will also be monitoring YouTube so I can be able to pull questions from there. Wanted to welcome you guys today. This webinar is being put on by Don Sapro with partnership with Naval X. So imagine Naval X being like the Navy super connectors. When COVID happened, we all were forced to go home, but it actually became one of the greatest things because we were able to utilize like YouTube and Zoom and WebEx and all these other great tools to bring you guys amazing content. So what we're going to do, what Naval X is doing here with Don Sapro wanted to bring you guys meaningful information. Yes, to be able to get continuing education points, but also just to inform you guys, to help you with your jobs, to help you in your everyday lives. And so that's why we're here today. And so we wanted to give the platform to Don Sapro to welcome our wonderful speakers today. And if you have any questions, go ahead and answer them. If you have any questions that you can, like, say if you're having troubles with Zoom or YouTube, you can go ahead and send an email to Julie. She's actually going to put her email into the chat right now. And then I'm going to kick it off to Jessica with Don Sapro, who's going to welcome you guys for the event today.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and a huge thanks to our partners at Naval X who've really done this series side by side with us. It's an incredible honor to have this panel today. We've got some real amazing leaders on the panel. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Standing Watch series, we basically started this in spring as a way to provide our first responders with resources for self-care and providing care to the community. And it's really grown into something in an organic way that has crossed a number of different occupations and services. And so we're really excited to have so many folks interested in our series. So I want to introduce our panelists, and I am not going to do them justice given who we've got on the line today. The first is President Caslin, who is the president of the University of South Carolina and former superintendent of West Point. Dr. Matthews, many of you who've caught our resilience webinars are familiar with Dr. Matthews, who's a professor at West Point, a prolific author and resilience expert. And our moderator today is going to be Dean Klein, Dean of the College of Leadership and Ethics at the Naval War College. And I met Admiral Klein about 5 or so years ago when I was working for the Chief of Staff of the Army in the Strategic Studies Group. And so many, talk about inclusion, my goodness, so many positive things have resulted from that engagement. And so just really appreciate her taking the lead in moderating this discussion on character. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dean Klein.
Great. Thanks so much, Jess. And it's a real privilege to be here this morning. I'm on the East Coast, and I know, Jess, you're on the West Coast. But I want to welcome President Caslin. And I think that as we think about resilience, I always think about connections as a way to, build up strength through numbers, strength through like having people who either challenge you or validate you. And I have to tell you that he probably doesn't know this, but before he was President Caslin, General Bob Caslin was Commandant of Midshipmen General Caslin was Commandant at West Point when I was Commandant of Midshipmen. And he was a couple of years senior to me and had been in the job for a couple of years. And I have to tell you, like, all rivalry aside, when it comes to sports, he demonstrated teamwork. He extended trust to me and shared so many of the lessons he had learned as commandant, right? This is before he was superintendent. And I learned so much from him. So it is a real honor to be here on a panel, moderating a panel with him. And Dr. Mike Matthews, I met, as many of you did, when he started his series, the Standing Watch series, back in August. So to General Caslin and to Dr. Matthews, thanks so much for joining us. We're here to talk about, I want to start the conversation with your book, which, though I haven't read every single page, I really appreciate the combination of practical advice from both of you and the science that Dr. Matthews brings to the study of people. So, you too brought together a book, and we're going to hear from you to talk to us a little bit about how the book came to be. But what prompted you to focus specifically on this topic of character, which so many people say, it's really hard to pin down? So what prompted you?
Well, good morning, everybody. And Admiral Klein, it's really an honor to be with you. And likewise, it was a pleasure and a privilege to be able to serve as fellow commandants together at our respective service academies. And thanks for being a great role model, a great leader that you were. So proud of you as now an admiral in the dean position for the Naval War College and the contributions you continue to make for our nation. So thanks, and honor to be with you. And thanks very much for the kind words. I'm really honored to be able to be on the panel with Dr. Matthews, my co-author. And frankly, he'll tell the story about how he hooked me into writing this book with him. I was a superintendent. I was getting ready to step down, and he had offered the suggestion. But we're not so much here to write the book as we are to talk about character and why character is so important in leadership. And it really came home to me when after I was a commandant, I became a division commander, and during the surge in Iraq, our division deployed to Iraq and northern Iraq during that particular time. And we probably had maybe about 23,000 soldiers and Department of Defense civilians. And during that particular period of time, at least with those in uniform, I had 78 senior leader acts of misconduct because of character issues. So I don't know how many senior leaders I had, but a senior leader was described as knee 7 or above in all officers and warrant officers. And in each particular case, you got a letter of reprimand or an Article 15, which really is a career killer. But what became more aware to me than anything else was not so much what was happening to the individual, but the impact of really lousy leadership on an organization, particularly an organization in combat, and the consequences that it had as a result of that. And I realized that when you had a character issue, you immediately lost trust. And when you lost trust, you lost the most effective ingredient in effective leadership. And subordinates don't trust you anymore. Leaders don't trust you anymore. And your effectiveness as a leader disintegrates. And therefore, it was time to pack your bags and go home. And it was unfortunate, but that was kind of the trend that was going on. I thought, as I was writing letters of reprimand in Article 15, for a year in theater, 52 weeks, writing 78, that's 1.5 Article 15s a week to a senior leader. And I asked my lawyer, I said, what's going on in our division? He said, sir, we're no different than anybody else over here. And I'm not sure it was a crisis in character or what, but it was something I felt that had to be addressed, because if you're going to be an effective leader, you must be a leader of character. So after that assignment, I had a couple other assignments and finally ended up as a superintendent of the United States Military Academy. And at the United States Military Academy, our mission there is to educate, train, and inspire leaders of character. We develop our leaders at the military academies with an academic program, with a military program, and with a physical program. And they are all excelling in all capacities. Our cadets and midshipmen, they excel all the time. But you could be number one in your class, but if you fail in character, you fail in leadership. And it's as simple as that. And I realized that even though we had those 3 development programs for academic and for military and for physical, we didn't have a development program for character. And character becomes the most important and most effective element in leadership. We ought to think about what is character and how do you develop character in people that are going to be leaders of character and trusted with America's sons and daughters when they graduate. So we really thought hard about how to put together a character program, and we actually instilled the character program while I was there as the superintendent. And so we became true to our word. In our mission statement, we educate, train, inspire leaders of character, so that we really had the character program that integrated across all of the other leadership pillars, but it became the most important of the 4 pillars, and that was character development. So let me just kind of stop there, and I'll be glad, Peg, to pass it off to Dr. Matthews as he can give his version of how this book came about, or anything else that you might have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. Matthews. What a tea.
Hey, so let me give you a little historical background on this. General Kazan and I, President Kazan and I, were born the same year. We both graduated from our respective institutions the same year. I went to a place called Drury College, now University in Springfield, Missouri. Never thought I'd serve in the military, but I did. I ended up joining the Air Force later on. But by the time the idea of this book came to me, I had spent roughly 43 years either learning to be a psychologist or being a psychologist and doing research, empirical research, scientific research on many things, but a lot of it on character. And, and literally like tested tens of thousands of cadets and airmen and soldiers and Marines even, and, looking at all this. And that's one way you learn about character, right? Scientifically and empirically. But then at that very same time, we launched our careers the same year. General Kaslan, then Second Lieutenant Kaslan, learned another way. He learned it through hard experience, through progressively more responsibility from platoon leader to company commander to battalion commander and all the way up to division commander and then commanding the Corps of Cadets. And what we want to do in the book was to marry up those 2 sources of knowledge to create a product that would be more readable and relevant to readers than if I had just written a science book. And so, if you heard President Kaslan's comments, that's why I wanted him to write this book with me, because he had all this huge wealth of experience.
Wonderful. Well, it is quite a combination. I saw in chat that somebody asked the name of the book, and while they're not going to shamelessly plug the book, The Character Edge, Leading and Winning with Integrity is the name of the book. I'm sure Jess will be able to put it in chat, but the book is kind of the launching point for today's conversation, right? Because we really do want to get down to the conversation around character. Because for all of you, for first responders who are still doing your job in the midst of a global pandemic, right? You doing this with character is essential to building and establishing trust amongst yourselves, building and establishing trust with the people that you serve. So with that, I think I would love to jump into conversation. And President Kaslan, as you talked about what, how Dr. Matthews convinced you to help write the book, you talk about the dash, and you talk about resume versus eulogy virtues, and the idea of thinking about what you want to be remembered for as a way to kind of set aside your North Star. How do you think about how you set aside resume virtues to be able to talk about eulogy virtues? And even though we don't really have to use the eulogy part, right? Those guiding principles, those guiding values that really help you rise above and focus on character.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Admiral. First of all, the whole idea of the dash is really Dr. Matthews' idea, but I'll be glad to, since you asked me to explain it, because it really is a fantastic concept. So, if you go to a gravestone or a headstone, normally you have the year you're born and the year you pass away, and you have a dash in between. And the dash is your life. It's the 10 or the 20 or the 100 years of life that you have lived on this earth. So what is accomplished within that life? What have you accomplished? So if I listed all the things that I accomplished, those are the resume virtues. Those are the things that I've accomplished. And some people accomplish a lot of great things, and so you can really pad your resume very nicely. But at your funeral, when someone gives you a eulogy, normally they don't talk about what you accomplished. They talk about what you're going to be remembered by. And they're going to talk about what your legacy is and what your values that you transmitted to society and how society became better as a result of what you did. And those are the eulogy virtues. And Mike can explain that much better. So what do you want to be remembered by at your funeral? When people talk about you in a eulogy, they're going to talk about really the values that you aspire to, the values that you've shared with other people and that you developed with other people. And it really boils down to what your purpose in life is. Some people really aspire, I don't want to be critical, but they'll aspire to having their name on a building or something like that when they pass away. The blank, blank, blank center or something like that. And to their credit, maybe it was a monetary contribution, whatever, it should be well earned and well deserved. But I choose to have my legacy written in the hearts and the character of young men and women who are going to be future leaders in our nation and future leaders in their community and in the corporate world. And if you have the opportunity to develop them, to aspire and to inculcate a set of values that will define their character in the midst of really some hardships and other challenging circumstances, and you're the one that had the means, the programs to develop them, to internalize that value set, and now they're the future leaders of our nation, there's no other better legacy that I would ever have than to really have a piece in the development of our future. So that's kind of how I look at it all.
I wouldn't add anything additional to that too much, and except to say sometimes, if life goes really well and you're lucky and you work at it, you find a place in life where you can do well at your job, but in doing well, do those things that President Caslin talks about. So I love teaching. I love teaching cadets. I'll be happy when I retire to say, well, I taught for however many years and educated 10,000 cadets. But when you know that you've taught them more than just the X's and Y's of psychology, more than just the technical stuff, but also help them develop as leaders and as human beings. That's what we mean by these eulogy values.
Yeah. So as Simon Sinek would say, you've both just really highlighted and focused on why eulogy virtues. Can I ask you, General Caslin, and old habits die hard, right? I know you're the president now, and that label probably supersedes General Caslin, but I knew you for a few years, so forgive the title change or reverting to your previous title. The how you stay focused, I think, would be really helpful to some of the audience members, and I think that's both of you. But General Caslin, if you could talk about how you stay focused on your eulogy values, and virtues rather, and both in the good times and the bad, right? There are probably some jobs where that was easier to do than others.
Yeah, thanks. You can call me Bob, Peg, if you like. I try to get everybody here to call me Bob. Anyway, so the thing that I remember when I first came back to the University of South Carolina, in one of the interviews, I was asked, well, why did you come back? Because I'm at that age I can retire, and I also retired from the military, and I've already been a president of the university, which is the superintendent of the military academy. So why are you coming back again and doing all this? And my answer is because if you have the opportunity to invest in the lives of future generations of people who will be leading their communities and their corporations in the future, and you have an opportunity to develop them and implant values and a set of ethics into them that they would internalize, There's no better legacy than to be able to do that. And that's what draws me back. So said another way, I would say that's my purpose. I think as a leader really needs to have a purpose, because if you're going to achieve an objective, there's a price you're going to have to pay. You're going to have to work, you're going to have to sweat, and there's going to be some tears along the way. And if you're willing to pay the price, you're going to accomplish your objective. But in order to pay the price for success, then you've got to have a purpose, a drive, an internal motivation that's going to get you through the adversity, that's going to get you through the challenges, that's going to allow you to rise to levels you didn't think you were even capable of. And if you're committed to that purpose, you'll pay the price that's necessary to be successful. If you're not going to pay that price and you're going to negotiate the price for success, chances are you're probably never going to get there. So you've got to have, if you're going to be a leader or character, you got to have a purpose. And that purpose is what's going to drive you through the thick and through the thin. And that's what's going to get you through whatever adversity is out there, and the resilience and the perseverance that's necessary to accomplish your goal and objective.
I might just, if you don't mind, just throw in a little bit of a scientific perspective on that too, to expand the discussion just slightly. So we've been focusing on these eulogy virtues, and those are important. But when I think about the science of a character, and those of you who were in the previous seminars that I did, or webinars, we know that there's perhaps 24 different character streaks spread across streaks that have to do with courage or wisdom or transcendence and justice, and a whole different lot of things. And I think it's fair to point out that science shows that there are indeed a cluster of character strengths that could accurately be captured under this idea of the eulogy virtues. So these like kindness, capacity to love, fairness, the ones that have to do with being a good person and developing others in that way. But there's also a cluster of character strengths that have to do more with performance. So being your best at your job, or you're the best student you can be, or whatever. And those are things like grit, determination, and self-regulation, and courage, both in moral courage, physical courage, perhaps. But lately, I've been thinking about there being a third cluster of strengths that contribute to both leadership and being effective as a SARC, for example, in dealing with the day-to-day stuff you deal with. And this third cluster of strengths are those that help build your resilience as a human being in the face of adversity. And so those are things like perspective, and social intelligence, so you build social networks, and maybe spirituality. I could name others. And there's some overlap among these, but the science is pretty clear that character is not just one thing. It's not just integrity or honesty. It's a whole bunch of things. And it's kind of neat to think about it in this way, that you can become self-aware. You take an assessment and see kind of like, where do your strengths fall? Are you more of a eulogy type person? Are you more of a get it done sort of person like grit? Or are you more, your strengths fall more in the resilience line, or are you kind of all three? Over.
Yeah, so that, I always love a framework to help people, kind of sort the information they're getting. So before we go to questions from the audience, because Jess said there's some great questions rolling in, I'd ask you to just talk about one other organizational structure that you had in the book that I think will also help solicit more good questions. But you talked about individual and organizational aspects of character, and you put them in 3 categories of strengths. You talked about head, you talked about heart, and you talked about gut. Do you mind talking about that a little bit, Dr. Matthews? And then I think what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Jess to start sending us some questions from the audience. Over.
Okay, I'd be happy to. And in fact, let's make it even more fun. Instead of calling it head, heart, and guts, let's all remember the Wizard of Oz. And what did the 3 characters miss? The Scarecrow, strengths of the head. The Cowardly Lion, courage, right? And the Tin Man, strengths of the heart. He didn't have a heart. So, it's not a new idea that character strengths, kind of fall into these categories. And this notion, as we present in the book, of head, heart, and guts, it's similar to the one I just mentioned before. But strengths of the heart are those dealing with kindness, goodness, caring for others, capacity to love, fairness, equality, treating people, in the right way. Strengths of the gut are more about being able to get through tough situations. Grit is probably the best example. Self-regulation is another. And strengths of the head are for people who are like many of us academics, who are able to kind of really get be successful in academia and get a lot of degrees and love of learning, curiosity, wisdom, and things of that. So what we found useful as we introduced this notion of this broad range of strengths was, rather than talk about them all in one space, which gets kind of confusing, we wanted to cluster them together. And maybe I toss it back to President Caslin about if you wanted to give an example from any one of those, whether it's Dave Hodney or Barry Bridger, or any of the others you think of offhand, you think that's useful, then we can go into the question and answer.
Thank you very much, Mike. Well, I think I could talk about all of these. The one thing I would talk about it, strength of the head. The example I think we use in the book there is Dave Hodney. He's now Brigadier General down at Fort Benning, Georgia. So they throw him, this is pretty incredible. They throw him into the city of Balad, which is right outside Samra in northern Iraq. Samra is where he had the golden mosque that was blown up by Zarqawi in order to get the Sunni Shia strife going so they can drive the foreigners out of the nation, and then Sunnis can override the Shia once again. So that's what he was right in the middle of, that kind of conflict. So what does Dave Hodney do in a very volatile, very hot environment? He finds two wealthy Iraqis, and he has the interpersonal skills to convince them to pull their money and create a bank. In Saddam, there was no such thing as a bank. So Dave Hodney says, I'm going to get these guys to start pulling their money together and create a bank, and they start lending their money out. So they do, and they start lending their money out to this old dilapidated tomato paste factory, and they take the loan out. Next thing you know, the tomato paste factory is up and running again. And then lo and behold, all the farmers in the area who hadn't been farming for about 4 or 5 years now, since the beginning of the war, said, now I got a product, I got a market that I could bring my product to. I'm going to start growing tomatoes. And they wanted to start growing tomatoes, but if you're going to grow anything in Iraq, you have to get, it's all irrigation, which means you got to get the water out of the Tigris River into the canals, and all the canals into the fields, which means the canals which were all busted had to be repaired. And to get the water out of the river and out of the canals, you had to get the pumps working, which means your electrical grid had to work. And in order to pull all of this together, it was the local government's responsibility to do that. So the farmers put pressure on the local government, and guess what? The local government responded. And when they responded, they became legitimate in the eyes of the people. So in any counterinsurgency fight, that's the keyness, is where is legitimacy seen by the main population? And if it's seen in the existing government, then all the other alternatives are pushed to the side. So it was a win-win-win. And then all of a sudden, all the farmers started growing tomatoes like crazy. They brought them over to the tomato paste factory. In the back, their Toyota pickup trucks. The factory was on Highway 8. If you've been over there, you know that's the main road between Baghdad and Mosul. As they were waiting to drop tomatoes off, they were plugging up the highway, and they got everybody upset. So some entrepreneur Iraqi plowed out a field and made a parking lot. Got everybody off the main road. And then there was a bunch of hungry farmers waiting to drop their tomatoes off. So another entrepreneur Iraqi went ahead and created a food stand and had food there. And then, believe it or not, someone actually created a small hotel or a motel back then, whatever that looked like. And then all these other businesses started coming to fruition, like labels for the cans and tin cans itself. And next thing you know, you had a booming economy in the middle of a combat zone, and not a single bullet was shot, simply because he had the character of good thinking. He had the character of the head. He understood the environment. He understood the natural hierarchy of order. He understood where to put pressure and what the consequences would be. And as a result, it was one of the most successful non-military operations to bring some degree of order into a very hostile environment. So that's an example of good thinking and the head.
Yeah, it's, the other reason I really like that structure is that nobody operates just on one of those strengths, right? That might have been he led with his intelligence, but he also had there was surely some risk associated because it was not what everybody else was doing, and so that takes risk, and so it takes courage, and so there you go. There's God, and I'm sure in there, right, there was also some compassion, but as you say, right, he led with his thinking, he led with thinking and really had a lot of foresight. I want to jump into the first question that we've gotten from our participants, and that's a couple people have asked, can you teach adult integrity or character? And General Caslin, I think I'd like to start with you. And Mike, you've done a great job complementing everything. So let's start with there.
I was hoping you were going to ask Dr. Matthews first, but I'll be glad to give it a shot.
Next time.
Well, yes, I think you can. And sometimes you learn through some really tough circumstances and consequences, and you learn by example, and you have experienced some tough circumstances and consequences. So and I believe character is not a born attribute. It's something that is learned. And if you look at the military academy model, we recruit cadets and midshipmen from across the entire nation. And they come from communities where they have learned values. They come from families, they come from schools, from teams that they participated on. And those values may or may not be consistent with the values that our military academies aspire to, like duty and honor and country. But by the time they graduate 4 years later, those values are the values that we in the military expect. It's what America expects of them. And as a result, they learn and develop them. And a lot of that learning is developed by making a mistake. So the first question you got to come to grips with, is it okay to make a mistake? And is it okay to make a mistake in character? In almost all cases, when the mistake is made, there's a consequence associated with it. And that consequence is essential. It can be separation from the military academy. It can be a repeat of an entire year. A lot of what we did at West Point often was to send them in the Army and they enlisted ranks for a couple of years, and they reapplied back and finished and got their commission afterwards. That was the consequence. But what I found was, when there was a breach of character at the military academy and we went into a character development program, particularly with a mentor, and that was done with a lot of reflection and introspection, that person changed significantly. Matter of fact, in almost every case, someone who had made the mistake and went through the character development program became stronger in character than those that didn't even go through the program. If you break a bone and it heals and heals correctly, the bone is stronger where the break was than it was before. If you have a defect in character and you learn from your mistake, you're going to become stronger in character as well. And I really believe that. So I believe character is a developmental process, and you can really benefit out of that. Now, that's not saying every single case has to go through that. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's what a lot of people say. And I think that learning process for an adult is got to be more dramatic. I mean, that event that occurred in that person's life has got to be accompanied with great reflection and introspection. And they got to see themselves as who they are and were, and the values that they inherited or that they believed in when the consequence occurred. And if you're going to change that, then they got to see themselves in a different light. They got to see themselves with a value set that they're going to embrace. Sometimes that occurs without a mistake. And it occurs in an organization that embraces and has a culture and has a climate that embraces a set of values. And they are immersed in that culture and that set of values. And those values start, they kind of start oozing. I'm Italian, so whenever I eat spaghetti and eat a bunch of garlic, I get around people, they can smell me. They can smell the garlic in me, so that's fine. So when you're around a set of values and those values are immersed in you, they're going to mold and change you over time. So I'm a believer that yes, adults can be taught integrity and character.
Yeah, I just jump in and say that the science of it supports those contentions. I do think it's probably a little more challenging by the time you're somewhat advanced in years, in your 30s or 40s or 20s, kind of out of school and into the workplace, maybe. But we certainly believe that you can change character at West Point among 18 to 24-year-olds who do it all the time. We help them evolve character. And the science shows there's maybe like 5 or 6 different things you can do. The first thing is take a character assessment and see where you stand on, and self-reflect on things like integrity and honesty and for that matter, physical courage, and kind of know what your strengths and weaknesses are. There are people who would run into a burning building and save a child, physical courage, but might balk at speaking up and correcting somebody, for behaving in an inappropriate way with like a sexual harassment sort of setting. So if you learn what you're not good at, maybe you can start practicing some of those behaviors, which is kind of the second piece. So it's kind of funny to say practice integrity, but if you, in your day-to-day lives, you probably do it, if you reflect on it, encounter, at least from time to time, situations where, maybe you see something's going wrong and you didn't say anything, but you probably should have, and usually get home and say, dang, I wish I'd have said something about that. Maybe it's a small thing, but if you start doing those small things, that reinforces integrity and helps you do bigger things later on. I think it's also important, I won't go through all 6 of these, but the social environment you find yourself in, who are your role models? Do you run with a good crowd that have positive values, who support integrity? So in some ways you can kind of to some extent, self-select and decide who your associates are going to be. And those have a tremendous influence on integrity. So wouldn't give up on it. If you make a mistake, we all make mistakes, right? And I think that's one thing that Bob was saying is we have to also learn from our errors when we have a character failure. Doesn't mean that your life's going to end and you'll never recover, but you can learn a lot of lessons from making mistakes.
Right. Yeah. So, right, without getting sucked too much into the vortex of just the mistakes part of the equation, right? There are people like Rushworth Kidder who have written about moral muscle memory, right? As important as physical muscle memory, and the practice, I think, Dr. Matthews, you and General Caslin both mentioned this, but the act of habituating holding standards, right? And when you deviate from the standards, or when you allow somebody to deviate the standards, right? You first have to recognize that they've deviated from the standards, then you do something about it, which I think really gets to the importance from both the organization, the climate that leaders set, right? First of all, that we all understand, those of us in military organizations understand the impact of the hierarchical nature of our work. And there are plenty of people who've also written about the impact of that hierarchy, right? We tend to, as human beings, we tend to honor the power relationship and behave accordingly. But the organizational climate, right, incredibly important in shaping how we act. And so that means that it not only is incumbent on leaders to just kind of correct the negative, but to set a very positive tone. And sometimes it's creativity, as General Caslin talked about in Iraq, and sometimes it is speaking up. Sometimes it's as simple as speaking up and not accepting the very tasteless joke that's told by one of the more popular members of whatever group you're dealing with. And that can be in the professional setting, or it can be outside the professional setting. And it's very important in setting the tone. And climate is affected certainly by those examples of negative leadership. And General Caslin, right, those 78 letters that you had to write, the 38 cases that you had to handle, in your 52 weeks, right? Hopefully you had, that's almost staggering to think about. And I know it was in a large organization. But one of the other things that's incredibly helpful that we've read in other literature is, hey, focus on also what people are doing well. And oftentimes we push that down. But for the audience of first responders, for the audience of people who are battling sexual harassment, right? It starts with this, it doesn't start, but one of the components is having the habit of correcting people when they do, when they step outside the acceptable standards. So
Can I just jump in with a quick example?
please.
So within the context of SARC, and sometimes, we focus sometimes entirely, maybe too much on the leader, whether it's a colonel or a general officer or a battalion commander, or not too familiar with the Navy organizations, but that equivalent. And so much of, and when it comes to the sexual assault and harassment, it seems like so much more responsibilities on all of us. It doesn't matter if you're a senior colonel, or, officer in 06, or if you're an E1, we all share that responsibility. And part of that responsibility is showing the standing up, and as you said, on the really small, seemingly small transgressions, and making a correction or a suggestion. So the story is, 5 years ago, when I was working with the Chief of Staff of the Army Strategic Studies Group, which Jess had mentioned, we had a variety. It's about 20 or 25 of us who were called SSG Fellows. We worked directly for Chief of Staff of the Army, General De'Aaron. It's a pretty cool job. And among us were some civilians, and among the civilians, some had PhDs and some didn't. And among those who had PhDs, some were women and some were men. And it became clear over the first 2 or 3 weeks that when we had meetings, that the colonel who was running the day-to-day orientations, whenever he'd call upon one of the men who had a PhD, they called him like Dr. Matthews. But if they called upon one of the women, it was Ms. So-and-so. So even though that person had a PhD, now, is that a great big deal? Is that worth ruining somebody's career over? Maybe not. But what's the impact of that on the person who's feeling that slight, however subtle it might be? How's that perceived by other women in the room who have PhDs, or who are also being called Ms. instead of doctor? And so, I don't remember exactly how it went down, but I think I talked to the person affected, and I talked to the colonel and said, look, you probably don't even know you're doing this, but, I think the guy was good-hearted. Did you know that you called me doctor and this other person Ms.? And he kind of goes, wasn't aware of that. And so and so what are the positive effects of that? Well, it helps that immediate situation. It helps all the women in the room feel more equal to the men. The colonel involved probably came out of the special forces community, hadn't worked a lot with women in the past, probably thought, oh yeah, maybe this is a way of thinking that it's habitual to me, and maybe I can change my ways. So a lot of goodness comes from just attacking those small, seemingly small things like that, those types of behaviors. If you do that, maybe you don't have to deal with more significant issues.
I love that example I'm sorry, President Caslin, go ahead.
No, Jessica, go ahead. And I just want to pile on that one thought here for a second. But Jessica, please go ahead.
I love that example that Dr. Matthews gave. So I was one of those fellows who, everybody was calling Miss. And for folks who know me, I'm generally pretty informal, but when you're in meetings where everybody's using a formal title and yours isn't used, that can be tough. But what was great about what Mike did is that he really demonstrated this idea of allyship. And so what was wonderful about that is that the group started self-policing. So I remember we went to another meeting after that, and somebody said, this is Miss Gallus. And one of my colleagues said, no, it's Dr. Gallus. And, it's just easier sometimes when somebody with more organizational power can communicate those messages for you. Over.
Yes. So if I can just pile on a little bit, this is just a great conversation. This is such an important topic. And Peg, I'm glad that you brought it up as well. So, let me just go to the West Point Honor Code. The Honor Code says at West Point that we do not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. So the cadets will be the first ones to tell you that the hardest one they have to internalize of that entire honor code is not duty, or not lying, cheating, or stealing. It's the toleration clause. And I would make the case to them that is probably the most important piece of the whole honor code itself is the toleration, because it's your responsibility as a leader is to establish the standard and to enforce the standard. So enforcing the standard is not tolerating substandards. Because what happens when you do tolerate a substandard? When you tolerate a substandard, you have now created a new standard. And if you don't make a correction on that standard when the standard falls, then you now have established a new standard. If you go on a 12-month deployment, normally those of you who have been on these deployments know that normally around month number 7 or 8 is where you start seeing a lot of safety incidences, and that's where you see a lot of discipline issues. And it's because you kind of get into this mood of complacency. And when you get into this mode of complacency, you're not making corrections to standards, just like what Dr. Matthews did when he talked to the colonel. If you're not making corrections to standards, then as a result, what you're going to do is you're tolerating a new standard. And sooner or later, the failure to make corrections kind of bottoms out. And what you end up doing is you end up losing the most important ingredient in that entire organization, and that's its discipline. So that's why, leaders must not only establish standards, but they have the responsibility to enforce standards. And by enforcing standards, you're doing your responsibility. That's hard. That's tough. You got to talk to people and say, no, this is not the right way to do it. And that's why I think the toleration clause in the Cadet Honor Code is the most important piece of that code itself.
Yeah, that's great. I'd like to maybe shift the conversation to building character. I think we've highlighted the importance of leaders setting the tone, leaders, establishing a climate of accountability. And I think what I took away from many of your comments is it's much easier to start small and get people like Dr. Matthews, right? Either people being standard in the way they address folks, people being allies, or finding out, as General Caslin just said, finding out, okay, what's really hard, and let's make sure we're doing that hard really well. So I think those are great examples of how we establish climate. I'd like to shift a little bit to building character, right? There's a section in your book that talks about personal courage is more than a one-time response. And you gave a number of examples, but the one probably most commonly known, because there's a book and a movie, and because I'm an aviator by background, is, when Captain Sullenberger landed a commercial airline on the Hudson. And, he was quoted as saying, and you talk about it in the book, we've all heard about ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary situations, right? Which certainly, Captain Sullenberger did. They act courageously or responsibly, and their efforts are described as they opted to act that way, right? Rather than kind of building their character to the point that, I think General Dempsey used to talk about it this way, is you have to be ready to be tested. You don't know when that test is going to come. So it's really important to build character. So Dr. Matthews, since I haven't asked you to go first, your turn.
Yeah, so it's if you look, we did an empirical study, or a colleague of mine did, Dr. Nansuk Park at University of Michigan. She did a content analysis of several hundred Medal of Honor narratives that go along with the Medal of Honor award, and looking for what character traits emerged. And of course, bravery was number one, naturally, because if you don't do something really super brave, right, you're probably not getting the Medal of Honor. But besides that, there were kindness and humility, and they were all more strengths of the heart. And the other thing I would say about when you study these exemplars of courage, very few of them would admit to being all that courageous. They felt that was just one more instance of them doing their job they trained for years and years and years to do. It happened that day. The circumstances aligned themselves, or maybe they stood out a bit more than the others in the unit. I think that's what Captain Sullenberg was getting at. You know, Captain had flown Air Force aircraft for a long time, became competent as a pilot, technically competent as a pilot, no doubt had his scary moments in the air, learned to manage a flight crew, deal with passengers as an airline pilot. When this one event occurred, which made him nationally famous, it was just one more drill, one more thing that he trained for. So he wouldn't look at himself as a hero. He just looks at himself as a pilot doing his job. And I'd like Bob's spin on this, but I think that that would be the sort of the normal response of people that get labeled by outsiders as heroes. I was a police officer for 15 years, and when police officers do something, you know, that gets in a good way, gets them in the news, people are, how did you do that? Well, and we just sit around and laugh. Say, well, they got you today. It was your turn to be the hero, because we ought to do the same thing every day, right? And nothing special in their minds. Bob, what did you add to that?
Well, that's great, Mike. I look at it this way. So if I'm holding a cup of coffee and it's filled to the top and someone hits my elbow, whether I want to or not, what's in that cup of coffee is going to spill out. So I have internalized a set of values in myself. And when someone rubs me the wrong way, whether I want to or not, my initial reaction is really the manifestation of the values I've internalized. They are expressed, whether good or bad, in that reaction, in that controversial moment. You know, so when you find yourself in controversy and you see how you react, that's a good indication of what kind of values you have internalized. And I really think character development is a process of internalizing values. Not only are you trained, but training is head knowledge. You got to go from head knowledge to internalization. And that requires some introspection, so that when you internalize these values, they become part of your very essence. So then when you're faced with what Captain Sullenberg was faced with, he didn't have to think what he had to do. I mean, it was an natural action, just like Mike had described, of what his training told him what to do over and over and over again. And this is the process of character development. It's the internalization of a set of values. You can do that through training. You can do it in an environment, a culture that has a left and right parameter of acceptable and unacceptable behavior that you operate in. But in the end, you've got to own those values so they become part of your very essence. A good metric to see what your value is, beside how you respond in a controversial situation or in a crisis situation, another good metric is to look at your private life. To look at your private life compared to your public life. And if you really want to see what kind of values, if you have a set of values in your private life that are consistent with your public life, then you're probably on the right track. And a good place to find your private life is go see what you post on your Facebook, or go see what you post or what Netflix films you're watching, or go see what you post on Twitter. You know, do you have an anonymous Twitter account? Why would you have an anonymous Twitter account, I would ask, you know? Do you have a set of values in your private life that's inconsistent with your public life? So these are things that I think you really ought to think about and really ought to reflect to see whether or not those values that you aspire to are really part of you and your very essence. So when you're in those Sullenberg type of situations, or you're in a compromising situation, you're going to come out of there proud of the fact that you acted with a set of values that you're proud of having.
Thanks. And I love, and I think it's in the book, but I love your analogy, or your metaphor rather, of the coffee cup. It kind of leads me to one of the questions. When teaching character, are there specific adult learning approaches that are better suited for doing so, whether it's experiential or transformative? And I know from my experience at the War College, where I have a number of wonderful teachers up there teaching kind of behavioral science topics, right? Helping folks who don't normally think about behavior as a matter of course. They look more at the outcomes without kind of peeling things back. And Mike, I would ask you, what have you seen as you've taught, right? So Bob has taught by his example and he's taught by his leadership. You do a lot of teaching throughout your career. So curious, over to you for this one first.
Yeah, so I think there's 2 or 3 aspects to developing character in young adults and adults, and education really is part of it. So at West Point we have a number of academic courses that inherent in them is formal education on the science of character, and it begins their plebe or freshman year with general psychology, and then in their junior year they get a course in formal course in leadership, and the first 3 or 4 lessons are explicitly on character, and then in their last year, what we call the first year, they take a course called officership and gets attacked again, and so or approached again. But that can only take you so far, right? And so I think the critical thing to really internalizing these values, a couple of things I would say. One is creating, if you're the leader, creating opportunities for people to practice in sometimes even in challenging situations, tolerating some failure where you can, so they can learn from that mistake, allowing people time for reflection, and then putting people in progressively more responsible leadership positions where really more and more matters to them. They come to realize that their thoughts and actions and attitudes influence others. And at West Point, you're lucky because you get 47 months to kind of do this progressively. If you're young enlisted person in any of the services, I guess maybe it still works. You work up from E1 to E2 to E3, you progressively more responsibilities. But I think doing that more from a leadership perspective, more systematically, more of an explicit focus on character, having genuine discussions with character, about character. The one thing we can all agree, all 376 participants I see here and the ones on YouTube, the one thing we should never do is have a required annual training requirement, which is one hour on PowerPoint, and then you've checked the character box. That ain't gonna cut it. It requires real behavior and real context with feedback and reflection.
Hey, Peg, can I pile on just for a second? Those are great comments, Mike, and I appreciate it. So I'm the president now of a university that's got 35,000 students and 8,000 staff and faculty. So I have the responsibility of creating a culture and a climate that embraces a set of values. That's what senior leaders have to do. So we've talked a lot so far this morning about individual character, but leaders also have the responsibility of building organizational character. And they have the responsibility of building organizational cultures and climates. And that's what we're about to do. So I'm very fortunate because I inherited a Carolinian creed that's been around the university for a number of years. And I'm piling on that thing. I am talking about it all the time. And when I start talking about it, other people start talking about it. When other people start talking about it, people start reading it and paying attention to it. And then you have to recognize behavior so that you can have behavior that's consistent with the creed so that it defines left and right acceptable behavior, unacceptable behavior. But we're not there yet. We still have a ways to go. So what we just scheduled was we're going to do an offsite. We're going to take all of our senior leaders from deans and above and all my direct reports, and we're going to have student representation on top of that. And we're going to do an offsite for a day and a half. And all we're going to do is we're going to talk about what is the culture and what is the climate for this university? What are the values that we want to embrace? What are the values in our Carolinian creed? Are they the right values? Do we need to add something else or not? And we're just going to have an honest offsite retreat discussion on what is the culture of our university? What are the values that are important to us? What are the values that we want to embrace? And I'm really looking forward to it because it's going to be a collective effort. And when you have these collective efforts and you have input in a collateral process, then you have buy-in from the bottom up. It's not a top-down push, set of value set. It's a value set that's developed by the organization itself. My job and responsibility is to steer it into the right direction. But this is the responsibility of leaders, because not only does a leader have to have an individual set of values and character, but the leader is also responsible for not only sustaining the culture that embraces those values, but to build that culture themselves. So I just wanted to add that in there. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so I remember it's Ashley or Julie. I sent you a couple of slides, and there's one that's figure 10.1. If you could just bring that for just a second. Hey, audience, it's one slide. I'm not going to kill you with PowerPoint. It's one I wanted to talk about, which reinforces and kind of gets at what Bob's saying. But it's the one with, probably come up here in a second. Here we go. Hey, so I won't go too deep into this, but what is character and where does it come from? So you think about, let's go back to the context of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Some units do better than others. Some people do better than others. And so I don't have this color coded, but let's say that character really is three really important domains which influence how you express character in a given situation. And one of those, it's a fancy word, it's intrapersonal. That means your habits, beliefs, attitudes that you've developed over your lifetime, good or bad, that you bring to the situation. Your integrity, your honesty, your grit, your caring about others or not caring about others, kindness or not being kind. Not totally etched in stone, but that's kind of where you are, and that's what you bring to the unit. Okay. And there's things in the environment, like, so if you're deployed, maybe you're under not getting enough sleep, or you're not getting consistent sleep, and you never know when you're going to be at a mission to go outside the wire, or maybe an RPG comes flying in and disturbs your nap. It makes you feel vulnerable. But then there's these things we've been talking about a lot, this last circle called social organizational. Who's around you? What's the nature, the cohesiveness of your unit? Is it a unit, whether it's 10 people or 1,000, which embraces positive values? So here's the idea I wanted to play with. So suppose that you're so think about red being really bad, yellow is kind of in danger, and green means you're good. So imagine that you're in yellow in the interpersonal zone. And you're kind of getting along, but you're prone to a few errors now and then. But you find yourself in an environment that's green, and you find yourself in a social/organizational setting that's green. In other words, you're around really high-performing people with positive expectations. You can handle the environment. It might be that raises your probability of good behavior and good character from yellow to at least yellowish green and going in the right direction. But let's flip that. Suppose that you are a person who's yellow in interpersonal, but you're in a social organizational setting that's red. What happens? So you go those intersecting lines, or if the environment gets really unmanageable. If you're already yellow, the social organizational, if it's red, can drag you down. So I think I'm just trying to illustrate visually what we've been saying, that, and again, thinking in terms of the sexual assault harassment environment, organizations that can make themselves bright green and its leaders work to optimize the environment can help those who may be yellow in the intrapersonal to change that color to a better hue of green, or at least a little closer to that. If that makes sense to you guys, that's all I had to say. And you take the slide down.
Great, thank you. It's always good to see a model. And Julie and Ashley, thank you very much for putting that up there. We have a question that they may ask about, moral development of military leaders. But Bob, I very much appreciate how you're thinking about character at the organizational level. So one of the questions we have, hey, historically, there've been 4 moral stages for discussing development of leaders, really of any type, right? There's compliance and training, and there's trust in the organization, integrity, and then knowledge from experience. As you think about the job that you have and very much appreciate, you're going to bring folks to an offsite, which we know is a best practice. Some of our companies that focus on character bring their team to an offsite every year. It's the first thing some organizations do at the start of each calendar year. If you're not an academic institution and the 1st of January means something in an academic institution, right? The start of the academic year means a lot. But what stage do you think, is there one stage that's more important? Is there one center of gravity that you think you're going to have to spend a lot of time on? Or is there another way you're thinking about, how you're going to shape the organization?
I think, thanks a lot for the question. I think the one thing that we need to focus on and build is trust. So trust is so tremendously important. I didn't realize how important trust was in leadership. When I finished my tour as division commander, went to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, in charge of Command General Staff College. I reported to General Dempsey, who was the TRADOC commander at the time. And we had been at war for about 10 years, and the last protracted war was the Vietnam War. And after the Vietnam War, our Army was really broken. So we were about that particular point, not necessarily having a broken Army, but being in a protracted conflict. And he really wanted to do an assessment of the profession of arms and how the profession of arms was hanging in there, what were the value sets. And we concluded out of all of that in any profession, you have a degree of expertise and you have a unique client. And in the profession of arms, our expertise was the lawful use and the moral use of lethal force, and we would be willing to give our life in its application. And our client is the American people. The Constitution says that we serve our civilian authorities who are elected by the American people. So really, in the profession of arms, our client is American people, and we had to have a relationship with American people, and that was a relationship built on trust. And we compared and tried to understand where we were in this profession of arms after 10 years of a protracted conflict. And we looked back and reflected on where we were during the Vietnam era. And the military at that time was just really a wreck. And it did not have the trust and confidence of the American people. And we certainly didn't want to get there. So then we really started focusing on this whole aspect of how do you develop trust in the profession of arms with the American people, and how do you sustain trust? And we realized that trust ended up being a function of two important variables: competence and character. And in the book, Dr. Matthew also talks about caring. But if you look at competence, the American people expected us to deliver our mission and to deliver it successfully, and in accordance to character, to do it in accordance with the values of our nation, the values of our Army, and the individual values itself. And those were the values that defined character. So you just look at how we were progressing in this conflict, and whenever we had a major firefight that had significant collateral damage or civilian casualties, or if we had a situation where we had a senior leader, a four-star general or someone like that, who was relieved of command, or if was relieved of command because of a moral issue, then you had a breach in character, which caused a breach in trust. And that was the connection. And trust became so tremendously important. And I never had seen it that way, because if you're going to be a leader and to be an effective leader, the most important ingredient in leadership you must have is trust. Your subordinates must trust you, your boss must trust you, and trust doesn't happen automatically. Trust is earned. And you earn it through competence and character. And character will swallow competence any single day. In other words, you could be number one in your class. You can be a four-star general, but if you fail in character, you have lost trust and you fail in leadership, and it's simple as that. So trust becomes so tremendously important. General Dempsey, I love him to death, and I follow him on Twitter, and every once in a while he posts these things, of famous leaders and their, different quotes and stuff like that. There was one that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and it was painful. I mean, I don't want to drag you through all that. And he says the most important element in a crisis, or he goes, the first thing in a crisis that will begin to break down is trust between you and your constituents. And I started realizing that it's exactly correct. Even as a president of a university in the middle of a pandemic, I had to do everything I could to maintain trust with my constituents. And the constituents are both internal and external. The internal ones are principally my faculty and my students. The external ones are parents, legislators, and the community of which we're a part of. And if I started losing trust, whether it was student behavior, whether it was a large number of positives or whatever, then it really got ugly. And there's plenty of examples of universities that had significant challenges and problems during this pandemic because they lost trust with their constituents. And trust is become so important to me in everything that I do as a senior leader. And as an effective leader, I've got to have trust with constituents. So if you ask me what is the most important ingredient in compliance and trust and integrity and knowledge, trust is the most important one. And trust is important because it's a function of competence and character of the two of them will swallow competence anytime.
Amen. Nothing to add on that one.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I love the fact that you talk about trust. I can almost hear the quadratic equation building in my brain because we try to build right frameworks or some kind of equation where we do something and understand it. But, we learned a lot. We, the joint services, learned a lot from General Dempsey, right? So we went from TRADOC to Chief of Staff of the Army to Chairman. And as chairman, he brought the profession of arms to the joint force to the extent now, and this is for the folks in the sapper community, those of you in the advocacy field, right? It is now written, this requirement for trust, this requirement for character is now written into the joint desired leader attribute. So it's no longer just the, like a good idea from those people who deal with character failures. It is, it's now written into joint policy. So super, super helpful. While we're on that, let's talk about reflection. I think, Bob, you talked about the opportunity for reflection and when you have a character failure, in your case, right, when you were dealing with character failure, but you also talked about, to what extent does a military justice system rehabilitate service members, or do you think it's just punitive? How do we use the system that really does help us hold standards? How do we help the military justice system as implemented to be more restorative, right? How do we help it build back trust when as a leader we've made the decision that we think that person is salvageable?
Thanks for that question. So that's a great question. First of all, I think that if someone has committed an offense, they have to be held accountable. And the military justice system, it has punitive actions as a result of their consequences as a result of their actions, and they're held accountable. That's important that they're held accountable for a number of reasons. Probably more important is that they can learn, and by learning they can change. And then by changing, they will rehabilitate. Even if they don't learn, then they still have to be held accountable. The second thing is you have to acknowledge the victim, and the victim has to be compensated. And however you look at it, compensation of a victim is that somebody is held accountable for the actions that they took. The other thing that is very important in the judicial system is that whatever the consequence is for whatever action was taken, it sends a message to the command. It sends a message to the organization. And that's important because that message ends up being a deterrent of any like action in the future. So people know that if they would do something like that they would be held accountable. So I think the military justice system is, I'm not here to evaluate it or criticize it, but it does serve the purpose of compensating the victim, disciplining and holding accountable the assailant or the guilty one, providing an opportunity for rehabilitation, and to send a message to the command or to the organization. And those are the purposes of what it must do. And I think each one of those is tremendously important and must take place.
I might just jump in just quickly. So it's one thing when it gets to the point where the UCMJ has to be invoked. I think that reduces the choices that a commander has. We talked earlier in this discussion about, the importance of making small corrections on smaller things, and through doing so, hopefully it doesn't rise to the level then of a serious infraction of the UCMJ. And we gave the example of a small thing of how you address your people in a formal setting. Men and women should be addressed the same. And so, you see that there's a historical example that we talk about in the book, and it has to do with New York City's approach to dealing with crime. And in the 1990s, they were just overrun, if you remember that, just overrun with street crime. Murders were over 1,500 a year. Times Square was a place you wouldn't dare go after dark, and so they brought in a new chief of police named Bill Bratton, and it's a little controversial still, I guess, but he invoked what's come to be known as the broken windows policing. All it meant is that he asked the police department to enforce, misdemeanor type of quality of living sorts of offenses, and in that sense, it's analogous to in a work environment, peers correcting peers on sexual assault, harassment sorts of things, or those types of behaviors. And over a period of time, under Bratton's leadership, murder rate dropped. The numbers dropped from 1,500 and some in 1994 down to 500 and something 5 or 6 years later. And that's another issue. We would go into to discuss the pros and cons of broken windows policing. But the analogy to how do you deal with character issues in an organization, I think the analogy is pretty clear. If we can deal with the little stuff at the lowest level, person to person, small unit leader to subordinate, that goes a long ways towards preventing than having to invoke more punitive actions under the UCMJ.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I think, both examples are really helpful. And I think the way both of you communicated today and in the book, right, you really help translate this. You take your experience and you help translate it so that people understand how it fits into their world. One of the questions that Jess passed along.
And how do we get to that particular point? So what we do in the military and the training program is that we train people, and we have a training program. So you can look at the number of sexual assaults and to see to what degree that has actually worked, that has actually helped. So the program also includes, if there's an alleged offense, that you have the right investigative tools and the investigative people, and then you have the ability in the judicial system to hold them accountable. And I think that's important. And then the other piece through all of this is that victims and survivors must have advocacy, not only advocacy through the investigation and through the accountability, but also advocacy and just helping them through the challenge and the situations and what they have experienced. But in the end, if you want that goal or that outcome where you have a sexual violence-free environment, then you've got to be able to have open, honest, candid discussion and dialogue. Because I really believe the open, honest, candid dialogue will really create the reflection and introspection that's necessary so that both men and women in that organization can see themselves of who they are, see themselves of who they really need to be, and be able to internalize the values of dignity and respect so that they become part of their very essence. And to get to that particular point, there's got to be more than just training. You got to have that open, honest, candid dialogue so that you can create the reflection and introspection necessary to have internalization of value sets rather than just head knowledge of the value set. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of how I see that's necessary to get from training to behavioral change, because that's what we want.
Let me just poke you a little bit. So I don't know if you want to go down this rabbit hole, but in the book, General Kazan talks about his experience when he first became superintendent, and you had this offsite or the gathering of the minds, in June, and we're approached with the issue with the rugby team, which has both sort of a cultural story to it, and then from the standpoint of you as the new superintendent, how you deal with a subculture that goes wrong in the sexual assault world and sexual harassment world in an organization like West Point, which has a larger set of values. Do you think that's worth just at least mentioning?
Yeah, so subcultures are, all subcultures are not wrong, but when you have a subculture that has a set of values that are not consistent with the organizational values, then you have an issue. It's almost like a miniature organization that has a private life different than their public life. It's what I talked about before. So subcultures, it's important to understand what the value set is of a subculture. Well, our rugby team had a subculture that it was disrespectful to women, and it was harassing, and it was really actually disgusting. So, and it all came to fruition, and there was a lot of controversy associated with it on how the administration handled it. I'm not going to go into that direction, but the teaching point in all this was a subculture, and it actually went on for 5 years. So how do you have a subculture with value sets that are not consistent with the organizational values, and it's allowed to exist like that? So what we did, we put in place is we put these anonymous surveys, and we had to do these anonymous surveys every year so that we can assess cultures and subcultures to ensure that they're consistent with our value sets. In the end, we had to remove the coach. We had to remove the officer representatives. There was discipline that was instilled. Again, that's controversial to the level that other people had expected. But in the end, we disbanded the program altogether for a year. Well, that was a shock. You want to send a message to the organization? Disband their program for a year. You'll send a message, and it's a strong message. And I'll never forget, I was leading a session of a group of about 20 cadets, and we were talking about this very topic about sexual harassment, sexual assault at the military academy. And there were two men's rugby players. This is almost 2 years later. The team had reestablished itself. They had just been disbanded for a year, got a new coach, and then the team was put in place again. And the team really embraced the values of duty, honor, country, and loyalty, duty, and respect. And then those two, I didn't know it, but those two rugby players were right there in that group when we were talking about sexual harassment, sexual assault. And they gave testimony to what they learned. I mean, this is an example of learning and having character that's not consistent with the values of our institution, but learning from your mistakes so that you can become stronger as a result. And when these two men had given their testimony of what they learned as a result of this experience, it was powerful. And even the women in the room were greatly appreciative that they shared what they had experienced and the change that occurred in behavior as a result of that. So, that's all part of character and character development. It's organizational character development on establishing left and right and acceptable limits. But these are the things that we had to deal with to get to the right place with respect to subcultures.
That's great. Thank you. Again, your stories have been phenomenal, and they help illustrate, how we think about these challenges. I was, before you jumped in, part of my partial answer based on my experience was sometimes folks need data. And so I love the fact that, you did a survey to kind of get some data to inform your thinking. It was not just, you didn't just have a hunch, you certainly brought your values to the leadership position you had at West Point. But, bringing in data is what I have found incredibly helpful in translating this to people who don't really want to think about what's behind respect, what's behind trust, what's behind character. So I want to thank you both. Bob, I could go on for several minutes thanking you for your mentorship of me and over the years, both when I was commandant and then when I was again at OSD trying to tackle this a little bit for General Dempsey, a little bit for Secretary Hagel, but you have been such a sterling example, and I want to thank you. But before we sign off, I'd love to give you, Bob, but then Mike, the opportunity to just make some closing comments because we're about out of time.
Well, thanks, Peg. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you all, and to all the people that are out there. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Um, and it's my pleasure to talk about character. I just really think how important it is. I've seen so many different stories of great young men and women that were great leaders and had some challenges with character and the consequences as a result of that. Keeping and maintaining your character in both public and private lives are challenges in themselves. To sit and have these kind of conversations, hopefully you become encouraged and emboldened, and that those value sets that you're embracing and internalizing become even stronger in both your private and your public life. And I'm glad to be able to help and answer any questions at any time or to further the conversations, and be glad to do that. But again, Peg, thanks so much for having us. We're very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bob. Mike.
I just bring us back to the hyphen, resume strengths and eulogy strengths. And I think these play out perfectly well in this first responder community, because I think if we all focus more on our eulogy strengths, filling in the hyphen with good stuff, that we'd all do better in terms of how we treat each other. And so a big part of that is being part of and contributing to organizations that value positive behavior and good character, and contributing in a positive way to that. And so everybody, thanks for having us. I promise I won't ever appear on Naval X again. This is my 6th time. I know you guys are sick of me. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
I would say just the opposite, Mike. You keep getting invited back. Jess, over to you.
Thank you so much. Wait.
Oh. I was going to say, Mike, people keep coming back. Like, we're just going to keep having you to keep getting the people what they want. Cheers for Mike. Cheers for Mike and President Caslin.
Okay, well, next time I'll bring our newly adopted little dog. He's from South Carolina, by the way.
Yes, absolutely.
He can sit on my lap and he can offer his opinion on things. I know he will. So that's silly.
Thank you so much.
It's great. I just love talking to you guys. So thanks to everybody for listening.
Huge thanks to everybody on the panel today. It is such an incredible honor. I'm humbled to be able to spend time with 2 of my mentors, and I've had the opportunity to hear General Caslin speak in a number of engagements. And on one hand, I'm mad that somebody can get up and be so insightful off the cuff, but as a number of folks are chiming in right now, this was a really, really valuable session. And I will say we've never had this many questions. We had over 40 questions from the audience today. And so I think that speaks to what an important topic this is. So thank you so much to all of you, Admiral Klein, for taking time out of your day to be with us and share your insights. And until next time. All right, everyone, have a good day.